a fatal eclipse, wall building, and all manner of twists and turns. Join me in episode 4 of my mini-series on ancient Sicily on the Ancient History Hound podcast. Hi and welcome. My name's Neil, and in this episode, I'm covering a famous or infamous episode in Greek history. The Sicilian expedition took place between 415 and 413 BC, and it involved Athens getting directly involved into the affairs of Sicily, though as you'll hear, it had made tentative moves earlier than this. As such, this episode will concern itself with events which took place from around 427 BC up until 413 BC, and on that point all dates are BC, just in case I forget to say it. Before I begin, the standard appeal for reviews and ratings. Now, there must be something in the water as these have started to occur more frequently, and I just want to say thanks to everyone who's been able to supply one. If you want to get in touch, I'm Ancient Blogger on Instagram, YouTube, X and TikTok. There's also Hound Ancient on X, and Ancient History Hound now has its own subreddit. Finally, there is of course my website, ancientblogger.com, where I will be posting episode notes for this episode, which will include a transcription, map, sources used, and anything else I think might help. I'd actually certainly recommend it purely for the maps, because I'll be talking about wall building, which does get quite complex, as you'll hear. Okay then, let's begin. In the last episode, I covered the events from 467 BC through to 440 BC. These involved the removal of a tyrant at Syracuse following civil unrest there, and the appearance of a rebel leader called Sicilian. Following the removal of Thrasybulus, the tyrant at Syracuse, a democracy was installed at Syracuse, and seemingly so in other cities on the island, though some, such as Acragas, seem to have had them already. We now need to skip forward to 427 BC, where two Greek cities were, shock horror, at each other's throats once more. The two in question were Syracuse and nearby Leontini. The former had risen to be the dominant Greek city on the island, though I should add the caveat that technically it was a colony, in this instance of Corinth. In the opposite corner was nearby Leontini. Unlike many Greek colonies, this had been settled not on the coast, but some 10 kilometres inland. The rationale for this was that it had been founded by an existing Greek colony on the island, Naxos. As such, it belonged to a practice I discussed in episode 1, where Greek colonies on the island sometimes founded sub-colonies to mark out their zones of control as part of a wider strategic game. You might also remember an important point made in that episode. Greek colonies weren't homogeneous and all friends. They often inherited the rivalries of the parent city-states they had come from. This meant there was often tension in the air. In the 5th century BC, the tyrants of Syracuse had made Leontini something of a plaything. It had become the subordinate to Syracuse, and the tyrant Hieron had moved populations from Naxos and Catana there. As such, perhaps there wasn't much goodwill between Leontini and Syracuse. We could even read into a recent event to help find evidence of this. When Syracuse had risen up against Thrasybulus, they appealed for help. Leontini wasn't listed as a city which sent any. In the previous episode, I used Diodorus Siculus as a primary source. He was a Greek born in Sicily in the 1st century BC. In this episode, I'm able to use the Athenian historian Thucydides. His famous work recorded the events of the Peloponnesian War, an event which started in 431 BC and ended in 404 BC, though we only have his account going up to 411 BC. Thucydides is a fantastic resource in a number of ways. As well as being contemporary, he was also involved with all of this directly. In 424 BC, he was a general and exiled after failing to hold Amphipolis, and so he had good insight, but he also had a certain bias, and this is very evident in the formation and lead up to the Sicilian expedition and how Thucydides handles it. I won't go into it here as this is about Sicily and the events there, but it's worth knowing that Thucydides framed the Sicilian expedition as a fool's errand of Athens overreaching its power, which resulted from a democracy that had been easily swayed to an idea of conquering Sicily. Now, there is plenty, believe me, plenty of criticism to be shared out about the expedition and how it worked, but the idea that it was to conquer Sicily isn't backed up at all. However, that is an argument for a different time and perhaps a different episode. So let's get back to Sicily. When, in 427 BC, Leontini found itself at war with Syracuse, it looked around for support. Athens was approached to provide help, and it agreed to help. According to Thucydides, Athens respected a kinship with Leontini, but it also realised the opportunity to disrupt the supply of food sent from Syracuse to the Peloponnese and on to its enemies. It also made sense to accept this type of invitation. Both sides in the war were keen to keep the allies they had, as well as court new ones. If Leontini was successful through being supported by Athens in resisting Syracuse, then perhaps other Sicilian Greeks would see Athens as a suitable ally. As such, in 427 BC, Athens sent 20 ships which took the standard route to Sicily. They headed south around the Peloponnese before sailing west along southern Italy and the Greek colonies there, some of which had only recently been founded, and you can listen to a bit about them on the episode called Magna Graecia. At Rhegium they put in, and this would be their base of operations. From here they attacked Locri in southern Italy and tried to take Messina unsuccessfully. On Sicily they also tried to take a local town called Anessa. You might remember this from the previous episode where it was referred to as Etna. It's not clear where this was exactly, but the intention seems to have been to drive out an existing Syracusan garrison and using locals to help them. This wasn't successful, but elsewhere Athens allied with local Sicilians to raid areas such as that near Himera. When the force returned to Rhegium, it was reinforced with 40 more ships. However, this became redundant, as in 424 BC there was a meeting of the Greek cities on Sicily at Gela. Here, the Syracusan Hermocrates, someone you'll be hearing more of later, argued that the incessant infighting between them all didn't achieve much and risked weakening them against an outsider. He named Athens as exactly this type of opportunist. Like many of the speeches Thucydides recorded, he wasn't there, but that doesn't mean he couldn't have captured the essence of it. Hermocrates made sensible points. The continual infighting between the Greeks on Sicily was detrimental in a wider perspective. It could also have unintended consequences with respect to inviting people from outside. After all, the Battle of Himera, which I covered in episode 2, brought a large Carthaginian force into what was a battle between two Greek cities on the island. In 416 BC, the Athenian interaction with Syracuse and Sicily escalated and became a dedicated section within Thucydides' history of the Peloponnesian War. It's often referred to as the Sicilian expedition, and this is in fact one of the first pieces of Greek history that I ever studied. The story of the Sicilian expedition is a great example of a chaotic cascade of events, and it started with a simple request from a jester, sometimes known as Segesta. If you've listened to any of the previous episodes in the miniseries on Sicily, you might recall that Egesta was a Sicilian settlement in the west of Sicily. It had grown and become Hellenized by the late 5th century BC. One of the great temples of Sicily was actually found at Egesta, though it wasn't completed. An issue which Egesta had was that it had a rival, the Greek city of Selinus, and the two had bad relations. These often resulted in skirmishes. In fact, Thucydides reported that the topic of land and marriage rights escalated into a full-blown battle between the two. Egesta had lost and was concerned that Selinus, with the backing of Syracuse, might press an advantage. A plea was therefore sent to Athens asking for support. For Athens, this request seemed perfectly feasible. It wouldn't require much in the way of resources, and it would allow it to check once more against Syracuse. It would also make sense for Athens in the wider context of what was going on. A very tenuous peace was in effect, the Peace of Nicias, which kept Sparta and Athens from making direct war with each other. Here, then, was an opportunity for Athens to flex its muscles and impress, as well as continue a policy of destabilizing support in Sicily for its enemies. Oh, and Egesta was very wealthy, so it would be able to fund much of the expedition. Athens even sent emissaries to verify this. In terms of deciding what to do, there were two debates at Athens. The first resulted in a small force decided upon with three basic objectives: beat Selinus, resettle Leontini, which presumably had become an issue again, and the wonderfully vague pursue anything which benefits Athens. It also agreed on three generals: Lamachus, Alcibiades, and Nicias. It's worth knowing that Nicias had no interest in going. At the second debate, he tried to bluff the assembly by stating that the initial force was actually too small and that a much larger one would be required. He hoped this would douse the enthusiasm for it, but sadly, it had the opposite effect, and the result was a much, much larger force being voted for. I should also point out that in the duration of the debates, the notion of Athens conquering Sicily, a theme Thucydides continually played upon, is not made explicit. Indeed, the first debate, where the outline of the expedition was agreed, and where you'd expect to find this condition gone into in detail, is in fact given the briefest of overviews. The Athenian force, which sailed from the Piraeus with cheering crowds around, numbered some 134 triremes, and along with these were the supply and support ships. The military force numbered some 5,100 hoplites, and along with these there were 1,300 light troops. Though this force sailed from Athens, it's important to remember that these weren't all Athenians. For example, of all of those 5,100 hoplites, only 1,500 were Athenians. This was because much of the expedition was made up using the allies of Athens. To avoid confusion, though, I will refer to these as Athenians or the Athenian force. Just remember that there were a great many non-Athenians fighting for Athens as well. At Syracuse, the news of the expedition caused a debate at the assembly. Hermocrates, who you might remember from earlier, warned of the Athenian threat, and as you might imagine, linked it to the wider ambitions Athens had. Set against him was a character called Athenagoras. It's unclear if Athenagoras ever existed, and he might have been a way for Thucydides to critique democracy, something he wasn't that keen on. It's probable that Athenagoras was a manifestation of what Thucydides didn't like about democracy, and invariably he gets things wrong. He claimed that Athens would never launch an expedition, and he's also used for gutter politics. He slings mud at Hermocrates, claiming that he's simply trying to scare everyone so he can make a grab for sole power. This instance of a debate is also used to bolster the idea that there was an active democracy in Syracuse at this time, and that's something that I mentioned in the previous episode. When the Athenian force arrived and landed at Sicily, it did so near Catana, but then it was refused access there due to a pro-Syracusan faction in place. The entire journey to Sicily hadn't been an easy one. For example, no Greek colony in southern Italy had received them with open arms, and more importantly, open gates. Even Rhegium had provided sparse hospitality, allowing them only to camp outside the city. Alongside this was money problems. Egesta had promised to fund the expedition, but news had come that Egesta only had 30 talents. Pun intended, a drop in the ocean of what was needed. There had also been an issue with Alcibiades, one of the generals, and in fact the most ardently pro-expedition general there was. He now found himself arrested when a ship from Athens arrived to take him back there to trial. 3 generals now became 2. There were some small successes though. The first action taken on Sicily involved a detachment going to Egesta to collect money and to raid the area near to Himera. Here the Athenians were joined with by local tribes, and they were able to collect a decent chunk of money out of it all. They also sent a small unit of triremes into the great harbour of Syracuse, where they stated their intentions for Leontini. Athens even managed to secure Catana as a base of operations. This was done by sneaking in some soldiers. When the pro-Syracusan faction saw what was going on, they duly scarpered. Catana then, unsurprisingly, voted to ally with Athens. Despite the problems then, Athens had secured a base of operations and through raiding brought in some much-needed funds. So what would happen now? What would Syracuse do? To understand the basic layout of Syracuse, I thought I'd give a go at describing it using my left hand, or rather, your left hand. Stay with me on this. Though, of course, as I should say, there will be maps in the episode notes which give a bit more clarity to it all. Here's a brief description of Syracuse using your left hand. To start with, make the letter C with the forefinger and the thumb of your left hand. Much of your left forefinger is Syracuse, the fingertip being the island of Ortygia, which was connected to the mainland upon which Syracuse eventually spread to. This finger poked out into the sea, and it was a great defendable position. Your thumb is the southern headland, and the gap between it and the forefinger was the mouth of the great harbour which formed the space inside the letter C that you've made. Syracuse governed much of the northern part of this, but there was plenty of shoreline which could be used, and would be, by the Athenian navy through temporary camps it made there. The great harbour was one of the two main locations for the activity between Syracuse and Athens. The second was on land, and where the initial engagements took place. Now, you can either visualise this or give it a go using your hand. Whilst keeping your thumb and forefinger in the letter C, bring your middle finger up and into a tight knuckle. This was and is a plateau north and northwest of Syracuse called Epipolae. It translated as the heights. It dominated the area north of Syracuse, and therefore the main routes to it by land. Okay, I hope that makes sense. Even if it didn't work entirely, I hope you understand there were two main arenas which would stage the following events that I'm going to get into: the Epipolae and the Great Harbour. And again, don't forget those maps on ancientblogger.com. The response from Syracuse was simple: to move a force by land and to attack Athens in its new base of Catana. However, Athens didn't want to hang around there. Instead, their intention was to move a force into the Great Harbour where it could make temporary camp on the shoreline to the south of Syracuse. But this wasn't easy. If they marched by land, they'd likely be attacked at points, and Syracuse would just take defensive positions, making this very costly. But if they went by sea, they'd be safe whilst at sea because the Athenian navy was at this point far superior to that of Syracuse. But the problem would be disembarking. They'd simply have a welcome party waiting for them on the shore. The Syracusans would then attack them when they're at their most vulnerable. What Athens needed was a cunning plan to ensure that the forces of Syracuse were out at a set point so they could move into the Great Harbour, and they came up with one. A resident of Catana was sent to Syracuse with the intention of baiting the Syracusan forces at a set date. He informed the relevant people that the Athenians at Catana were an easy target because they were barracked away from their weapons, and they're also very unpopular there. So, if Syracuse were to attack at a set date, the rebels in Catana would set fire to the Athenian ships and lock the gates, preventing the Athenians from getting to their gear. It was a perfectly feasible plan. After all, Catana had been pro-Syracusan, so there was presumably a faction within it ready to revolt. So it went then that the ruse was believed. On a set date, whilst the Syracusan force marched near to Catana, the Athenians were already in their ships and sailing into the Great Harbour with the knowledge that they could safely disembark and make camp. The Syracusans, once they realised what had happened, had to turn back, knowing now they'd face Athenians who were formed up and in good order and had chosen where they wanted to fight. The Athenian camp was south of Syracuse and on the other side of the river Anapus, or, as it's known today, the Anapo. It was here the first big battle between the two sides was fought. It was also here where the Syracusan line broke and its men retreated. The exact mechanics of battles in ancient Greece are debated, but generally speaking, when one side broke, it went from a group of men in tight formation to a group of individuals fleeing for their lives. Here then was the chance for Athens to sweep all before them and get that big victory they needed. But to do this, Athens required something it didn't have: cavalry. Thucydides did mention 30 horses being brought over, and even if this was present though, it was a negligible amount. You couldn't really do much with that. Without cavalry, the pursuit of the fleeing Syracusans wasn't easy. Worse still, the Syracusan cavalry were able to cover their retreating colleagues and help prevent a rout. The battle had been won by Athens, but a much larger opportunity had been lost. Thucydides wrote that 250 Syracusans fell that day, but this would have been much, much bigger if Athens had cavalry to take advantage. It's been speculated that Athens could have won the war here. With cavalry inflicting ruinous casualties, the outcome might have been Syracuse forced to accept a treaty. As for why Athens had neglected cavalry, it's unlikely they'd simply forgot about it. It's more likely that they expected to be able to recruit horses once on Sicily. This would have been much easier than transporting them in that large force which left Athens. However, for whatever reason, Athens had been unable to recruit the horses at this time. While Syracuse was licking its wounds, the Athenians packed up and sailed back to Catana and Naxos, where they wintered. At Syracuse, Hermocrates made a speech in which he appealed for support to be requested from overseas, specifically Corinth, its parent city, and Sparta. Syracuse also realised that Athens' next move would be to cut them off and lay siege. This would involve walls constructed to the north and northwest. All eyes turned upwards to Epipolae, and a small counterwall was started by Syracuse from the city towards it. The work of hands was matched with that of words. Camarina, as mentioned in previous episodes, had an interesting relationship with its parent city of Syracuse. Located to the southwest, it would be a loss if they threw their lot in with Athens. Hermocrates visited Camarina, where the Athenian representative was already making diplomatic overtures. Cue a scene where Thucydides has Hermocrates banging the drum of island conquest, but also taking it up a notch. When Athens had fought against Persia, it wasn't just to free the Greeks, it was actually so they could enslave the Greeks with their own empire. Yet more Thucydidean subtlety in action. Camarina eventually decided to go with Syracuse, though only just, which, if true, underlines how loyalties on Sicily were rarely permanent and often tenuous. Thucydides commented that even though Camarina had agreed to support Syracuse, it sent minimal aid. At Epipolae, competitive wall building was now taking place. Athens was trying to build walls to cut off routes to Syracuse, and Syracuse in turn was intent on building walls which would intercept those of the Athenians, preventing them from encircling them. Athens also received the much-needed cavalry. This was formed not of horse, but riders arriving by sea with the horses bought for them locally. They therefore had 650 cavalry. What a difference this could have made earlier. The action now descended into raids and counter-raids against the walls of either side. Athens built a central fort known as the Circle on Epipolae. The action also continued down from Epipolae, with the wall being extended south to the harbour. This ran across marshland, and the two sides met in a skirmish which, though Athens won, cost the life of Lamachus, the general. Nicias was now on his own. But even with that loss, the Athenian position was strong. It had fortifications on the Epipolae, and now the navy had made camp in the great harbour. The pieces were in place, and Syracuse started to panic. This panic was almost to lead Syracuse to surrender. But I say almost, because it was at this crucial moment that a Corinthian called Gongylus arrived and delivered much-needed news. There was support coming, and this included a Spartan called Gylippus. With that, Syracuse was reassured. Gylippus arrived near Himera, where he set about recruiting an army. Sparta hadn't set any forces. Remember, the peace of Nicias was still in place, which prevented Athens and Sparta from attacking each other directly. The lack of Spartan soldiers might also have been because Sparta didn't consider this theatre of conflict that important. And we might see the lack of commitment from Sparta in the form of Gylippus himself, because he wasn't a full Spartan citizen. He was a Mothax, meaning that his mother was most likely a Helot. But as you'll hear, he was certainly up to the job regardless of his parentage or social standing. In the west of Sicily, Gylippus assembled an army of around 3,000 men. He then marched this force eastwards, across the island, and past the bewildered Athenians at Epipolae, who chose not to attack. It seems a strange decision by Nicias not to take the advantage here. These were raw recruits, and Athens may have fared well. But this line of safety-first thinking was how Nicias seems to have conducted himself throughout the entire campaign. It's plausible that he considered these troops more valuable to Athens alive, where they'd be in Syracuse and needing to be fed, rather than risking his troops against them. With this said, and with the gift of hindsight, this moment has been noted as an important opportunity missed. The arrival of Gylippus energized Syracuse, which devoted more men and time to building the counterwalls. Nicias now turned his attention to the great harbour. Though Athens had made a temporary camp there, it needed something more permanent, and so fortifications were set at Plemmyrium. This wasn't located in the harbour itself. Instead, it was on the tip of the southern promontory and the mouth of the harbour. If you remember, and how can you forget my improvised hand map geography of Syracuse, this was the tip of your left thumb. What this afforded Athens was a place to stow important supplies, and also where they could receive supplies. The fortification of Plemmyrium was one more step in applying a grip around Syracuse, but it wasn't complete, and perhaps the soldiers based there watched as reinforcements from Corinth sailed into the harbour and turned north to the Syracusan docks. Back on land, the tide was turning. Syracuse, now with more men, managed to complete a counterwall, meaning that Athens wouldn't be able to complete its encirclement to the north. At this point, Thucydides recounted the contents of a letter sent to Athens from Nicias. It made for desperate reading. The Athenian ships were in a poor state, the morale was low, and Nicias was in bad health. He even offered to stand down and to be recalled. The response from Athens wasn't what Nicias had wanted to hear. He was to stay on, with 2 temporary generals being named to support him. Reinforcements were coming, along with 2 new generals. Where the earlier encounters between Athens and Syracuse had been land-based, the action now became more naval, and a series of engagements took place in the Great Harbour. Athens, even though its navy wasn't exactly ship-shape, still had a strong advantage. Their crews were much more experienced, and in a warfare where ramming and manoeuvring were key, this gave them much more of an opportunity to succeed. In the initial naval battle, Syracuse sent out 80 triremes against an Athenian force of 65. Athens was victorious, but this in part had been a sideshow to what Syracuse had intended. Whilst the battle took place in the Great Harbour, a Syracusan force was led round to the forts at Plemmyrium. These were overrun, and valuable resources for the Athenian fleet were lost, as well as an important strategic position. In the next naval engagement, Syracuse looked to level the watery playing field with a development to their ships. The standard attacking tactic of a trireme was for it to hit the enemy ship at an angle or to shear off the enemy oars. As mentioned, this took skill. For example, knowing at what point to start to row back just before the collision so the trireme didn't get stuck into its opponent. Triremes generally avoided ramming each other head-on, that is to say, hitting the enemy prow with your prow, because you could easily damage your ship as much as the one that you're hitting. The new development that Syracuse had was to reinforce the area around the front, the apotis, so that the ramming head-on was now an option. This provided the less skilled Syracusan crews an easier option. The following naval battle took place over a few days. The Syracusan fleet withdrew, which was read by Athens as a break in the fighting, a perfectly reasonable assumption, except the break was shorter than Athens had expected. A market had been brought close to the shore, meaning the men were back on the triremes and back in action much quicker. This caught Athens off guard. They were attacked with small ships filled with men hurling javelins at the rowers. The result was that the Athenian navy retreated, and it was only saved by the naval defences they had set up at their camp on the shore of the great harbour. Things were looking up for Syracuse, but then another twist. The reinforcements for Athens arrived under Demosthenes and Eurymedon, the two new generals. This numbered some 5,000 hoplites and supporting forces. It was exactly the lift Athens needed. Demosthenes wasn't interested in continuing with the naval strategy. He decided that the fight should be continued back on land at the walls on Epipolae. If the Syracusan forts there could be taken and some of those counter walls, well, Athens could finish off the land encirclement of Syracuse. Keen to retain the element of surprise, Demosthenes took his men up the narrow track to Epipolae by night. At first the tactic worked, with the fort taken and confused cries in the dark. 600 Syracusans met the Athenian charge, but were routed. Better still, the counterwall was taken, but then it started to go wrong. The Athenians, perhaps drunk on their success, kept moving forward, but did so in an increasingly disordered and disorganised manner. Eventually, this loosely formed line of cheering men met a Syracusan force which was far more organised. This wave of men broke against a line of spears. Thucydides wrote how the Athenians now panicked and ran back towards their own lines and into men who were still pushing forward, oblivious to what had happened. The moonlight offered confusing outlines. Who was friend or foe? What was happening? Athenians mistook those running against them for the enemy, not their retreating colleagues. In the height of the confusion, Athenian attacked Athenian. What made things worse was that many of these men had no experience of their surroundings. They ran off the cliffs accidentally, but apparently sometimes intentionally. Panic and rout, the bane of any hoplite battle, made merry amongst the cries in the darkness. Some made it down from Epipolae, others were killed the following morning by Syracusan cavalry, which picked them off at ease. The situation for Athens was becoming ever worse. For a while, they had to camp on marshland down from Epipolae, near the great harbour. This wasn't a great place, and sickness was becoming a real issue. There was that glimmer of hope, though, an opportunity to retreat and sail back to another location nearby, perhaps Catana. However, this opportunity was lost through a most unlikely occurrence, a lunar eclipse. Eclipses in antiquity were often considered omens. They also offer a date, not just a date, but a day, hour and minute, because eclipses don't occur at random, and it's possible to calculate both ones to happen and ones which have occurred. A lunar eclipse was visible at Syracuse on the night of the 27th of August, 413 BC. We even know its duration. It started at 9:41 p.m. and ended at 10:30 p.m. The soothsayers in the Greek camp decided that it was a warning for the Greeks not to leave for 27 days, and Nicias, famous for his piety, wouldn't hear of any argument against it. So the Greeks stayed, and this was great news for Syracuse. Their main concern was that the Greeks might yet escape and regroup somewhere else on Sicily. Gylippus knew that more naval battles would be required, and so spent the time the Greeks had kindly provided for him drilling his navy and its crews. This paid off. When fighting resumed, 86 Athenian ships took on 76 Syracusan ones, with Syracuse winning and the general Eurymedon falling in battle. On land, Gylippus led an attack which almost took the Greek camp. It succeeded in capturing 18 ships and killing their crews. There was one last stand to be had. Athens had to break out and leave with their navy, but Syracuse was guarding that narrow mouth into the harbour. It was here that around 100 ships on either side fought with desperation at their backs. Athens had to force a way out, and Syracuse couldn't let them win, and thus allow them to pick up their army and escape. Syracuse took the day, and the Athenian triremes headed back to camp. The navy was broken. When it was suggested that they might try once more to make a dash for it at dawn, the sailors refused to board their ships. If Athens wanted out, it would be by foot. At Syracuse, Hermocrates had a headache, and not one caused by a hangover, but indirectly by many would-be hangovers. His men had been celebrating their fantastic victory and spent the time drinking. Hermocrates was concerned that the drunken state his men were in, and would be for a few days, would allow Athens to steal a march and make a break for it whilst his men were busy searching for painkillers and swearing that they would just never do this again. Okay, I made that bit up, but you get the point. What Hermocrates needed was a way of keeping Athens in camp and not on the road, whilst his men rested up. As mentioned, if Athens made it back to, say, Catana, they would regroup, and all the success would be for nothing. Here was the chance to repay Athens for that ruse which had been used by them when drawing Syracuse out to Catana. Riders were sent to the Greek camp who feigned that they were sympathetic to the Athenians and warned them not to make the roads by night as these were being watched and guarded. A day later, the Athenian force broke camp. Some 40,000, which included large numbers of non-combatants, began a grueling march with only what provisions they could carry with them. The sick and wounded were just left behind. The plan, as much as there was one, was to head north and then meet up with friendly locals who could help them get to Catana. However, at every point they were harassed and attacked by Syracusan cavalry or lightly armed units. Worse still was that the key roads and passes moving north were now blockaded. After suffering greatly, the army turned southeast and made for the sea, hoping that they could still find somewhere safe to camp or some local allies. This unlikely event never took shape. Instead, more flying missiles and more dead lying in a trail behind them. At this point, the Athenians had formed into two separate groups, one under Demosthenes and one under Nicias. The main Syracusan force caught up with Demosthenes, who duly surrendered. Nicias carried on for a short while, but he too eventually had to accept the situation and surrender. Thucydides painted a truly pitiful scene where his men, tormented by thirst, made a dash for the Asinaris River. They fell on each other, on their weapons, and stampeded over each other into the waters. The Syracusans just watched, and eventually Nicias realized that after some 3 years of fighting, it was finally over. The survivors were taken to the quarries, where they were to be sold as slaves, though many perished in the hot sun there. Demosthenes and Nicias were both executed, though it's important to note that Hermocrates was apparently against this. Instead, it was a character called Diocles who pushed for this extreme outcome, and we'll hear a bit about him in the next episode in discussing the reforms at Syracuse and his curious death. The effect of failure was huge for Athens. Sometimes it's painted as a crucial turning point in the Peloponnesian War. This is true in a sense. The failure caused Athens to lose prestige, and in a material context, a large amount of men and resources. Perhaps a more significant outcome from the expedition was that it broke the peace of Nicias, and so Sparta was able to resume actions directly against Athens. This wasn't because of what went on at Sicily, but because Athens had relied on support from its allies heavily in the expedition. Some of these allies had demanded that in return Athens needed to restart raiding the Spartan coast, as it had done prior to the peace. By resuming this activity, the peace of Nicias, much like the man himself, was no more. For Syracuse, this was a huge success. It wasn't just that it had won. The action had caused some cities on the island to ally with them. Nothing unites like a common enemy. In addition, it had defeated a large invading force and won naval battles against the supposedly unbeatable Athenian navy. In the next episode, I'll be picking up with what happened next. Though Athens and her empire had been put back in their place, there was another empire which would come out of retirement, and at Syracuse there would be the return of something else which would collide against this. Until then, keep well and stay safe.